remember, what we're talking about here in this kind of evolution, evolution goes from, you go from a stable self-structure, right, stable, then dissolution, falls apart, then integrates again, comes together at a higher level, right? That's how evolution works. At the level of matter, at the level biologically, and also psychologically and spiritually. So, you could say part of this is really about how to become a very strong person. That's a very easy way to think about all this. How do I become a very emotionally, morally, psychologically, morally, philosophically, and spiritually very strong person? How do I become very strong? Okay? And I don't just mean physically strong, because you can be physically strong and be a coward, right? You can have big muscles and be a coward at the level of your soul. You can be weak. So that's not the strength I'm talking about. It might include being physically strong, but it transcends it infinitely. It's a much deeper level. So this kind of development that I'm speaking about, is it's all encompassing, and I refer this capacity would have to do with the strength that we have at the level of our soul. How strong is anybody at the level of their own soul? So, often when I think about the soul and talk about the soul, it's the way I have been describing it has to do with our capacity for virtue, for moral virtue or goodness. So what is any particular individual's capacity for virtue and goodness? What is the individual's capacity for moral virtue or goodness? And in this particular case, in other words, and so the answer to that is, in relationship to these teachings, the moral virtue and goodness would be you could define it in two ways. One is, how big are their aspirations? Because to have very big aspirations, you have to be very courageous. You can't be a coward, right? You can be crazy and have big aspirations. You can be deluded and have big aspirations. You can be a fool and have big aspirations. But you can also be humble and serious and have very big aspirations, right? So on one hand, it would be having the courage to have very big aspirations on one hand, and the other, it has having the courage not to crumble or not to dissolve under pressure. Now, the way the ego works is, because the ego really is, the ego has many definitions, but in the way I'm speaking about it, it's very wretched, right? No accountability. So the ego, since it's so emotionally based, the ego basically goes with how I feel right now. You understand? That's more or less the ego in the way I'm describing it. That's what its tendency is. It kind of goes with the feeling of the moment. So if I feel inspired, I will say yes, without any thought about what I'm doing. I'll say, well, I better not say this unless I'm thinking long term. Am I willing to back it up? Today, tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, 10 years from now. I better not say anything. I better keep my mouth shut because I know I'm a coward. Right? But if someone is really arrogant, say, yes! Why? It just feels so good right now. It feels really good. You follow? And then, of course, when the weather changes or a few clouds come in the sky, they change their mind. You say, well, what happened? You say, well, I don't feel like it. But you just said it. Does any of this sound familiar to you? I'm sure you must know somebody like this. The other is, if you're looking through the lens of the ego, that maybe if you can, let's say you recognize something is absolutely true, right? Philosophically true, morally true, and spiritually true, right? You recognize something is morally, philosophically, and spiritually absolutely true. And you know it, you don't have any doubt about it. And at the same time, you realize that you're too much of a coward to respond to it. Even though you know, morally, philosophically, and spiritually, it's absolutely true, right? And then the problem with that doesn't bother you very much. That would mean your soul is not in good shape. It means it's okay. That's a bad, in the way the teachings go and the way I think of it, that's not a good place to be. So in order to be able to do this, not just for the short term, but for the long term, what I'm calling the soul is what we need to develop. If you don't develop your soul, your ego will win. If you don't develop your soul strength, your ego will define your destiny. So the soul here is the best, what we're talking about is your capacity for virtue, your capacity for moral virtue. You follow? And I think that developing your soul in the way that I think about human development is much more important than being what I call an enlightened person, which would mean, and the enlightenment here is you are directly awake to these non-relative or absolute dimensions of reality and of consciousness itself, which is what enlightenment's all about. But I feel soul development, in the way I'm speaking about it, is more important even than that.